Now, as a service line coordinator, I then had to take that tray that was contaminated and take it back to sterile process and get it turned over for the next case. But obviously I had time to do that because I wasn't the one trying to get in the room with the patient and get my case going. So just having that stuff on hand, having it at the ready, having it available where we could get it quickly takes a lot of the pressure off when you are being pressed from, it feels like, every angle to get in the room and get done faster and get turned over and get going again.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
All right, Clean Freaks, welcome back to another episode of the Beyond Clean podcast. This is Season 30, Tray Command. I'm your host, Bobby Parker, and joining me in studio is the one and only superstar guest co-host for the season, Angela Benson. Angela, welcome back to the show.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thank you. I hope to live up to the superstar status that you're giving me.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything crazy been happening in the sterile processing world in the last week since we last talked?
Oh, all kinds. There's always moving parts, fires to put out. Just trying to think. Even there's, the main water pipe had a leak into our sterile storage area. And fortunately, none of our instrumentation got damaged. But unfortunately, some of the implants that we store there for reps got a little bit of water added to them.
Oh,
yes.
no.
So
the ones
always something.
The ones that get shipped in sterile packaging?
Yep.
Oh, good grief. That's not a cheap
It is not
event.
a cheap, no. And then you have that awkward, who's responsible for those?
Goodness. Well, promise that was unplanned. Angela keeps me grounded here, but we're talking about tray logistics today and where things ought to be stored, particularly whether or not they should be stored close to the OR, how we can keep them safe. And yeah, maybe the implant room ought to be kept away from your water main is a takeaway. Today's conversation is all about sub-steriles, whether or not we should keep some of those high touch items in the OR, or maybe you're one of those departments that is lucky enough to have sterile processing situated like geographically in the center of the OR. If you are, I am so jealous. Like the whole sterile processing department is a sub-sterile. Been in a few of those. Pretty fantastic, but not the case for the most of us. So to answer that question, we're bringing in our good friend Melanie from over on the First Case podcast, an OR nurse, to talk to us about her take on the great SPD versus OR storage debate. Where should we keep these trays? So after a short break, we'll be right back with Melanie Perry.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us now in studio is Melanie Perry, operating room nurse and co-founder and co-host of the First Case podcast. Our friends over at First Case. Melanie, good to have you on the sterile processing side of the fence, I guess. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys today.
For sure. Now, we've talked about sterile storage a lot in Beyond Clean, and we've talked some about tray logistics this season so far, but what we don't get a lot of opportunities to do is to talk to the OR about how they feel about sterile storage. And so with your background as an operating room nurse, I'm excited to get your take on how instruments ought to move around the OR, where they ought to live, and kind of hear from more of, what we would call the customer's perspective from the sterile processing world. So before we dive into that, you want to give us a little thumbnail of kind of who you are and what your experience in the OR has been like, and then we'll talk sterile storage after that.
Absolutely. So I am, like you said, I'm the co-founder and host of the First Case podcast, which is the sister podcast to Beyond Clean. And we do talk all things OR, but we also try to bridge the gap to sterile processing time and again to have these conversations. But also in the real world, I guess I am an operating room nurse. I've been an OR nurse since 2011. I've been a nurse in some capacity for 23 years, which is hard to think that I've been in healthcare that long. I'm certainly not that old, I don't think. But anyway, but in the operating room, I have been a circulator. I've been a scrub. I have been a charge nurse, team leader of orthopedics, which orthopedics, and you think of sterile storage and you think of instruments, we touch instruments a lot in orthopedics. And then I have since gone back to being a circulator, working in the OR, doing what I like, taking care of patients. But I have had a lot of challenges through the years as I've worked especially when I worked as a team leader, trying to manage our instruments and get our trays where they needed to be, and seen a lot in the years that I have been in the operating room for sure.
I have no doubt. As you talk about all of the different roles that you've done, it reminds me that we need to have an episode one of these days where we just talk about who are all the bodies in an operating room. Because I tell you, when I started in sterile processing, I had never had to spell OR before. I seriously asked my preceptor, like, I had heard of an ER. What is an OR? So that's the context of where I was coming from. And then the expectation in that department was sterile processing kept all of the sterile inventory. We got phone call requests, and we would bring it through a sub-sterile door to the room. We'd come into the room, and I just remember that sinking feeling of walking in there quietly. The lights are dim because it's a minimally invasive procedure. Everybody's looking at the monitor. Nobody has realized you're even in the room, and you're just standing there like, someone please notice me. Who do I hand this to?
I can't touch anything.
That's right. Yeah. So I think that would be a lot of fun to dive into.
Yeah, you could even think of later. Sesame Street. Who were the people in your neighborhood, right? And talk about.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I'll let you come on the show and be Big Bird. That's
might be more like Oscar the Grouch some days when we're dealing with the OR, but that's okay.
For sure. Well, we're off to a great start here, Melanie. We like to have a little bit of fun over here. Well, we always try to start these interviews at the level of definitions, and kind of similar to my experience with, not knowing all the lingo or who all the people are in the OR. Since we're talking about storage today, why don't we do some definitions around storage? The word that gets thrown out a lot is a sub-sterile, is where a lot of instruments are being requested to be kept. And I just mentioned it as kind of the door that we delivered things through. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what is a sub-sterile in the OR? Like, what are they? Why are they there? What's submarine like about them?
Sure. So actually, it's funny that you want to define it, because it's actually not something I've ever really thought about defining until we were going to have this podcast. It's just a thing, and it's just what we have. So to actually think about, okay, what is it really and what's it there for? But when you're in an operating room, case is open, patient's open, like we've got all of this stuff, the sterile environment. You really don't want to be walking right up into the OR from the outside hall. This is busting on up in the OR from the outside with all the traffic, all the air, all the just possible contaminants and other things that are floating around outside our operating rooms. Our operating rooms are fantastic with their air exchanges and all the other things that they have. And every time you open that door, you mess it up. So the idea a lot of the times with those sub-steriles is to give us this semi-sterile subspace where we can, go in from, and then from that room, we can then enter the operating room. And it kind of gives us that buffer zone between the outside hall and our operating rooms. And then our sub-steriles too, also, now, granted, we're not doing flash sterilization anymore, but those sub-steriles also gave us a place where we did have a sterilizer where we could flash something in the past if we were going to do that. And I know a lot of sub-steriles do still have sterilizers in them if we need to, get instruments going in other places. And our sub-steriles also a lot of times will have those things that we will need quickly, things that we just don't need to be running back up to sterile processing for, and we need them now. So our sub-steriles, a lot of times, if they're big enough, will be storage places where we can have access to important items that we need to grab. But they serve a lot of purposes. A lot of it has to do with airflow and control so that we can go in the room from a certain direction and really keep that outside from coming inside. But then also the access to the sterilizers, to your blanket warmer, to certain instrument trays. They give us a lot of options to have stuff at our fingertips when we need it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And from an orthopedic standpoint, as you mentioned, has kind of been your specialty. I've seen on a lot of total joint doors, the outside door I want to call it the public hallway, but the less controlled hallway says, total joint in progress, do not open this door. Mm-hmm. And they're really trying to control the airflow and what particulates are settling from the air down into that total joint. And so, having that room behind the OR that's a little bit more controlled, where there's maybe less stuff in the air, probably some considerations about pressure relationships between those rooms. I'm not entirely sure what those look like, but makes sense to have that vestibule area between the outside world and the OR. Kind of like at the, if you go to a butterfly garden and you leave, they like put you out into a room where they check you for butterflies before you go out into the world. It's
kind of the same thing.
It's the butterfly vestibule. Right. That's what we've got going on. All right. So you mentioned sometimes we store surgical instruments in that room, which from a sterile processing perspective and doing rounding with infection prevention, personally, I always thought was a little weird. If we've got a really small sub-sterile and you've got a steam autoclave in there and those things never truly shut off, it can be a little challenging to keep the temperature appropriate, the humidity appropriate in that room. And so I thought it was odd that we'd be storing instruments in there with it and really kind of battling with the autoclave. But we did it, and we monitored the temp and humidity and made sure everything was appropriate. Could you tell me maybe what are some of the upsides or some of the moments where it's been really valuable to have some instruments right at arm's length out there in the sub-sterile, so that it's worth it to have battled the flash autoclave for storage?
Honestly, anytime that things are not going right, they're not going well, I needed this 5 minutes ago, and it's right here, and I can grab it and I can get it in the room. So a lot of the things in a previous OR that I worked, we had a larger sub-sterile that we had about 8 ORs that fed into. So it had 2 autoclaves in it, but it also had a larger bit of room for instrument storage. And because of the specialties that worked in those rooms, the service line coordinators for those specialties kept emergency instrument sets in that sub-sterile. So when things went down, because they go down quick and you're never really ready for it, you could run right out of the OR into the sub-sterile, grab what you needed and get back in the room. Because we don't have time. We don't have time to maybe, if sterile processing isn't on the same floor as us, wait for something to come up from the elevator from 3 floors down or from across the hospital or another building. We don't necessarily have time to even leave the room and run down the hall across the department to where some sterile processing might be. And so those are the times when you feel it the most. But also just the fact of the way that ORs are functioning today, especially with our press and push for faster turnovers, for getting patients in, get them out, move. Speed is a factor. And turnover times are constantly being pushed down our throats when it comes to our efficiency. And when there's a hole in a tray, when there is a contaminated tray, when there's something, a lot of our orthopedic trays, especially our vendor trays, for us, those were in that really big sub-sterile that we could go and find another one. This one has a hole in it, but I'm going to go. So we've got another one here because we always had to have backups of our vendor trays. And so, but it was in that sub-sterile, so I could grab it. We didn't have to lose time, I guess, in our setup by trying to go to sterile processing, get another tray, and then come back. Now, as a service line coordinator, I then had to take that tray that was contaminated and take it back to sterile processing, get it turned over for the next case. But obviously I had time to do that because I wasn't the one trying to get in the room with the patient and get my case going. So just having that stuff on hand, having it at the ready, having it available where we could get it quickly takes a lot of the pressure off when you are being pressed from, it feels like, every angle to get in the room and get it done faster and get turned over and get going again.
There's a little bit of a debate out there with ideas about whether instruments should be stored in sterile processing department or maybe in the OR. Any insight on that?
Well, I'm obviously team OR in this argument, which clearly.
That's why we brought you here, Melanie.
Basically, let's debate.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay. I got my. Yeah, I'll pull my boxing gloves out, right? But no, like just for the reasons I just mentioned, and also for the bigger just logistics setup. Once again, if sterile processing is on another floor, if they are maybe another building altogether, or they are God knows where. Like, how long is it going to take me to get the instruments that I need? And let's be honest. I will make fun of the OR right now. We are not known for being patient. We are not known for being very nice when we call and we need something. We needed it 5 minutes ago. And I mean, that's not an okay thing. And yet it is reality. And I know that sterile processing technicians around the country feel that pressure and stress when we call and we're yelling because we need something and we don't have it. So let me apologize for everybody for us being rude, and then let's move forward. But it's the availability. It's not there. We can't get it. We need it. And so when there's opportunity to store it in the OR and to store it correctly and to do it properly, of course, we're not just going to cram things in corners and not store it properly, because then that leads to a whole host of issues. But if we can store it properly and we do have the room, I feel like it's better to have it there, especially high use items, things that we might be using multiple times, or even those emergency sets, those emergency things that we might need at a moment's notice. We don't use them all the time, but when we need them now. Those are the things that I think are really helpful to have in the operating room.
Yeah. So with storage, there's often good reason for why departments are motivated to try to centralize and try to keep it in one spot, right? It's a lot easier to track the inventory. From a case pulling perspective, it's quite a bit easier to get them put together for the next day. It also helps a lot with par levels. You know, I remember the sub-steriles that we kept at all the different ORs that we were servicing in our sterile processing department. We had 3 different buildings with ORs in them. And the 4th building on campus is the one we're sterile processing, where we didn't have any ORs in our building, but we were going around and trying to keep up with the par levels for like peel packs and quick grab items, things that in our tracking system at the time, we didn't have a really good system for measuring tracking. So we just had to visually go and, you know, with a spreadsheet and count, you know, do we have the 5 in this bin? Do we need a couple more for that one? And fill up the bins. A lot harder to keep those sub-steriles stocked and kind of emergency ready whenever you've got a duplication of inventory of what we've got back in SPD, and then we've got it also in the OR. So there's certainly a lot of good motivations for wanting to try to centralize storage where we have more space potentially over by the SPD instead of in the OR. But I guess the bigger question, because I don't think anybody would object to the idea of having, you know, the really urgent kind of quick grab items or potentially emergent items in the sub-sterile. But if you've got the space, like, is it worth putting the whole inventory of sterile instruments up by the OR? Or do you think that if that was in like a supply chain area within maybe, say, a 5-minute delivery time, do you think that works?
I think it could, for sure. I mean, if we have the space, obviously the OR is going to argue for just, if we've got the space, leave it here, let us have it. But in reality, I understand the constraints that sterile processing is under when it comes to tracking those trays and keeping up with all of the supplies and instruments that you track. And if there was a good way to ensure delivery time, to get things there quickly, to, you know, honestly, just to give the OR the assurance that they were going to get what they need when they needed it. And then I think that would work just fine. But that obviously takes a good open communication and a good relationship between your OR and your SPD, and really keeping that open line of communication and teamwork so that we can both work smoothly.
We talked a little bit about communication and that trust piece in the opener to the season. We had Hank on and talked to him a little bit about like that customer service piece and communicating that. You said it works if you can, you know, ensure a certain delivery time. And we both know that that's not a reality. Like how do you make promises and guarantees? But it does remind me of a story that we tried to do in our department of ensuring that delivery time, because I know when you're standing there with the surgeon and like surgeries come to a halt that, you know, 120 seconds feels like 120 hours. And so we took a timer to all the deliveries that we made and tried to figure out what they were, and then picked like the top, like 25% of the longest deliveries, and set a cap of like, a delivery promise. We promise to have trays to you in X number of minutes or less, provided that the thing was sterile, just to create some urgency for our folks. And then also to give a little bit of assurance to the operating room that, we're aware, we're timing these things, we're moving with urgency, all of that. I'm curious, if you were to have a sterile processing department communicate that to you, like, we can't put the trays up in the OR. We got to keep them down in SPD. We promise we'll have them to you in X number of minutes after the time that you call. Like, what would you want that promise to say? Like, how long of a delivery is too long?
Oh, that is an interesting question. And I think very request specific, because if I'm in the room and my patient's on the table, like, there is no time. Like, we need it now. And so how do we get it now when it has to come from sterile processing to our OR? I don't know how you actually solve the urgency of it when the patient's on the table, they're already open, we're in the middle of the case, and there's nothing we can do because we don't have a replacement for this instrument that just fell on the floor and we've got to get another one. And in reality, what happens is the circulator ends up running out of the room and they're going to be meeting sterile processing halfway and they're going to be grabbing it and running back just because we need it. And I think the surgeon and the team feel like something's being done if they see the circulator leave the room versus the circulator just sitting there waiting on something to show up. I think it adds to the stress when they don't see anything happening, so they feel like nothing is happening. And that's just my own personal observation of how I feel the dynamics in the room go. But I think there's some psychology to that. If the circulator leaves, obviously something's being done, so they're getting it and, can come back.
That's kind of what we were trying to do with the psychology of it. The temptation is to describe like an average delivery time, but it's really not all that helpful because nobody experiences an average. Say like your average delivery time's 2.5 minutes. Well, if sometimes you get the trays there in 1.5 minutes because it was really convenient and easy to find, other times maybe 4.5 minutes because it was difficult to find, nobody actually experiences that average. And so the idea of communicating that X number of minutes delivery time was to try to build some of that trust and some of that urgency and limit the number of phone calls back. I'm not sure how much it limited those repeat phone calls, but I like to believe that we were at least making a good faith effort towards making it more palatable to have to stand there in the room while you wait on the tray to get there, which I know is uncomfortable. Angela, I'm curious, did your all's facility keep instruments in the SPD or the OR, and how'd you manage those delivery times?
We keep the instrumentation in sterile processing. So we have a sterile storage area. And since we're situated right below the OR and the only elevator we have in that area just goes right to them, our delivery time actually isn't that long. If anything, it's, you got the whole waiting process for your biological, things like that. And you have different people trying to give the best time to the OR, kind of like you're just trying to please this person. So that kind of is where you can also lose that trust where you're, trying to give them the best. You want to give them the answer that they're looking for. But for us, it's really just honestly, again, with that one elevator, taking the time to stand there and wait for it to come. If there's someone else using it, it's kind of crazy. We don't have stairs nearby. Not that anyone really wants to grab a heavy tray and go running up the stairs and go to deliver it. But again, there's that urgency, especially depending on the tone that, of the person asking for it and the urgency of, we need it right now because the patient's on the table and things like that. But we also do have in the sub-sterile area as well. We have it sterile core, a lot of instrumentation for kind of the just in case something, instrumentation got dropped, etc. But it's actually not that big of a barrier for us because again, with our situation and where we're at, it just makes a really good convenient area for that.
That is helpful. And just a reminder that it's situation specific. I know that the emphasis, regardless of whether you're team SPD or team OR, is we got to take care of the patient. And, Melanie, we talked about how long it can feel waiting on the tray to arrive. Have you ever been in a situation where waiting too long for a tray actually caused a problem for a patient? Like, is this just patient safety talk or is it kind of the real world when you're there in the OR?
So it has actually affected patients. There's a couple of different scenarios that kind of come to mind off the top of my head, but the first has to do with actually vendor trays being brought in for cases like our total knees or total hips, all of those trays that have to come in and they don't show up until 6 a.m. And our case is scheduled for 7 o'clock. There's no way that those trays are going to be ready. So what happens? Well, our patient who got here in the morning has been through pre-op. They're ready to go. We can't do their case. We don't have their instruments. We don't have what we need to do their case. And so they get bumped, which now means that the patient In the best scenario is just sitting here hungry for a few extra hours while we get all of their trays ready, and then we can do them later in the day. Worst case scenario is we can't get them added back in, and they've made all these preparations for this being their surgery day, and then, just kidding, go home, we're going to reschedule you. And that's really not good customer service or good care for our patients to do that to them. But I've also had other instances, and this doesn't have to do with vendor trays. This is more just tray availability within the operating room, because you're going through a whole day. Obviously, this is also coming from my orthopedic experience, but we have so many trays. And the trays from the beginning of the day have to get turned over so they can be ready for trays later in the day. They can be ready for cases later in the day. And either communication failed or someone else thought somebody else ran the tray and the tray didn't get run. And here we are, case number 4, and we don't have the tray from case number 1 so that we can do this case, and we don't have what we need. And now here we are at a standstill, and we can't go. We can't do our patient's case because we don't have their tray. And then the same kind of follow-up. Do we have another patient that we can do instead? Can we bump this person? Can we rearrange? Can we do something so that we can keep going? But every patient needs their instruments. We have to have the supplies we need in order to be able to do this patient's case safely and efficiently and effectively. And if we don't have it, then suddenly we're stuck scrambling, trying to figure out, is there something that's second best that we could use instead? Which, do you want to be the patient who gets the second best option? No, or
definitely not.
Do we just wait and try to figure it out later? And then we have an upset, hangry patient who doesn't understand everything that just went down behind the red line that they didn't see. And there's no reason for them to understand all of that. All that they see is that we can't do their case. And so either way, it has a negative impact on the patient's care and on their perception of the services we provide. And we don't want that.
We actually had an incident where it was a nickel allergy that wasn't caught for the patient, and we did not at our hospital have the implant set that was going to be safe for them. So we had a delay in the sense of waiting for it to be transported across the city to get it to us, and then having the, very difficult decision to do it from start to finish, or have the discussion of, was it properly transported? Could it go right to the OR and be used? So there's even more factors. The scheduler didn't catch it, or, maybe the question wasn't asked at the appointment ahead of time. So there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that can cause those as well. With sterile storage and us discussing whether or not it should be SPD or OR, with that can come case cart pulling. Who do you think would be the best fit for doing that? The OR, another team, sterile processing?
So this might not be a popular opinion for the folks in the sterile processing department, but I do think a dedicated team is the best solution for pulling your cases. And here's why. In my experience, the different operating rooms that I've worked in, when we had a dedicated team, and yes, our dedicated team was within sterile processing, but when we had a dedicated team, that team knew what to pull. They could do it very quickly. They could pull efficiently because they had a system. They did this every single day. In the operating rooms where I have worked, and we just have to go find somebody to go pull cases. And today it's going to be Sheila, and tomorrow it's going to be Sam, and the next day it's going to be Dave, and it's always somebody else, and they don't want to do it. It's a miserable chore that's how it gets viewed. Nobody wants to do it. They kind of halfway do it, and they're not as used to going through those prep cards and looking for all the stuff and finding where everything is. So they are slower sometimes. And really what you get is when you have somebody who doesn't want to be doing it, it's not their everyday job. They don't necessarily do the best job as the team that is dedicated to it, committed to it, because that's the job they do every day. And they are proud of the product they are putting out, which is those pulled cases. So that's kind of what I've seen. And the struggle too, also when we have our surgical techs, a lot of times pulling cases, they don't even look at the prep cards. Like, oh, I know this doc. This is what they use. We're going to use this. And then you get a case card and you're like, what the heck? I don't have anything I needed, because the scrub tech, yes, they went off their experience, but they went off their experience based off maybe a particular kind of case. But the actual case we were doing, if you looked at the prep card, was a little bit more nuanced. There was a little bit more different, little other things we needed. And because they didn't look at the pick ticket, they didn't catch any of that. And so it's like, no, dedicated team. They know what they need to pull. They can read those pick tickets. They can pull those cases quickly. And that is their job. And they own it and they do it well. And I think it makes everything run more smoothly, from actually having what we need on the case cart to also not having extra supplies and wasting things and having things in there that we didn't need to pull in the first place.
Well, and the counter argument is just about that, the experience level. If you're in an outpatient surgery center and the nurses are the one pulling the carts, they know all their procedures. They're able to pull it. They're not even looking at that pref card, which is great until somebody goes on vacation. Someone else has to step in. And the pref cards haven't been updated in 15 years because we've just been pulling them based on passed down institutional knowledge.
Yep. That tribal knowledge that nobody else really knows if they're not here. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Sucks.
Yeah.
And then we switch our supplier and then you have substitute numbers.
Yeah. Or somebody goes in and rearranges and now you don't know where anything is anyway. And you can't find your 4x4s because they're not on the shelf where they used to be. They're all the way over here now. So not that I'm speaking from experience or I'm bitter, but anyway.
Yeah, can't tell at all. Well, and there are a lot of thoughts about what the team should be that's pulling those carts. There is an argument to be made for people working up to their license. And so we want OR nurses doing nursing. In some cases, the argument's made, we want sterile processing techs with hands-on surgical instruments. And sometimes it's supply chain that's pulling the carts, but I agree with you. Making the transition between teams is difficult. There's always that question mark of, are they going to understand these cards and are they going to care about it, the degree to which they should care? But regardless of which team you switch it to, it should be somebody that's dedicated to getting the right thing on the right tray and has some skin in the game about that preference card being updated and being right, because that's a tremendous source of waste whenever you're leaving things off and getting extra phone calls or putting too much on and putting things away that weren't needed in the first place. So anyway, that's a whole episode. We're going to have to leave it at that discussion. All right. I'm going to give you the last word here, Melanie, as time's coming to a close. If you could design the ideal sterile storage setup for an OR or sub-sterile, you told us that your team OR where instruments ought to be stored. If you could design the ideal setup, what would it look like?
I don't think I've ever been asked this question before. Now I got to think about it. Honestly, it would be well organized, which seems like a no-brainer, but sometimes in the hustle and bustle and busyness of the workday, things get very chaotic and things end up in various places. But that storage area would be easy to access. It would be easy to find what you were looking for and like well labeled or just really good information so I know exactly where I'm going. And two, that sterile storage area, especially if it was in a sub-sterile, would not also be used for storing equipment. So I wouldn't have to climb over equipment to go get the tray that I'm trying to pull because somebody shoved some piece of equipment in there because I needed to get it out of the hallway. But it would just be easily accessible, easily findable, and very organized so that it would be quick to get what I need and get back to my room.
Yeah, that's the dream, right? Well organized and easy to access and quick to get back to the room. Unfortunately, that just tends not to be on the radar on the priority list whenever these things get built. We've got this little bitty hallway, and we get creative, and things are crammed in corners and trying to stuff those items in there, and then everything else is down in supply chain or SPD. All right. Well, Melanie, a lot of questions still that could be answered around this topic. I appreciate you pushing back a little bit on the SPD-centric storage model that often gets purported here on Beyond Clean. So thanks for making us feel uncomfortable. It has been great talking with you about this. I'm sure folks will have more questions, more conversations around this sterile storage topic. What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
You can always find me on LinkedIn. My name is Melanie Perry. You can find me there for sure. I'm happy to answer messages that way, or you can reach out to me at melanie@firstcasemedia.com.
Yep. And if you haven't listened to the First Case podcast, go give it a listen. As she mentioned at the start of the show, they do talk SPD from time to time, and she's often looking for SPD guests too. So maybe an introduction there will land you on an OR show, and you'll get to talk to the OR about why sterile storage should happen in SPD. All right. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks for joining us for the show today, Melanie.
Thanks for having me.
And that was Melanie Perry, founder of the First Case podcast and co-host of that podcast. Angela, really interesting conversation around sterile storage. I still feel a lot of that tension about wanting to keep some of those high-touch items organized close to the operating room so that they can get them grabbed quickly. But there are so many logistical challenges to solve around managing the main inventory down in SPD and then duplicates of that inventory up in the OR and making sure that they stay stocked. And so there's definitely a bigger conversation here to have about who pulls the case cards, who checks the par levels and all of that. But bringing me back to some of those logistical challenges we faced in the department that we were running, but definitely a good reminder for us that keeping delivery time short and keeping those urgent items close at hand, really important.
And then you have just so many involved. You have, the nurses who's going to go grab something and maybe they're not quite aware of what they're looking for. And then maybe they don't understand that the scrubs are, their protocol would be to call down to SPD and say, hey, I just took the last, power set off of the shelf up here. That's our emergency grab and go. And then when you're doing that, you're calling down to say that, but you don't realize then that tech maybe is involved with grabbing something for OR1. And they're like, okay, yes. And maybe they don't write it down. They don't communicate it. And then that spare is not distributed back there. So there's just obviously a lot of moving pieces and different staff coming in and trying to remember those little nuances of, where we have a lot of little, items stashed away in the OR that actually isn't in a PAR system. We have, our staff on our third shift who takes care of making sure those, little grab and goes are stocked. But then, you start going to look and you're like, wait, why is this general set up here? And why is this stashed away over on this? And it starts becoming different specialties on those really stressful days. They're like kind of quietly finding a little home for it. So that way only that, those few people know to come grab it. And then that does make a challenge too, because even with our tracking system, it's only as good as if you're actually scanning those items to the locations. And does that location that they squirreled away even have a scan point? So, as someone's going through, they're like, oh, I see that that's there. Let me just update the scan. And if it's not even there, then that's how you truly do lose some of that inventory as well.
Yeah, definitely a lot of people involved in that process, particularly when all the storage is in the OR. Some of the trouble that you run into is whenever something goes missing and they call SPD to try to help them find it. It's like, I don't know. We scanned it out a week ago. We gave it to you. I don't know where people put it. And so when you've got this, team of 50 individuals who all intermittently touch sterile trays and you don't have a dedicated team managing where it goes on the shelf and pulling it, it can create some challenges. Angela, when we were talking about this before, you mentioned to me that your case cart process is managed by even another group of folks. You've got sterile storage in your department, but materials management is coming in and picking the supplies. And so even another team involved in it. So regardless, I guess, of who's picking it, really important to make sure that you keep to a minimum those little tribal cubby holes of where things get hidden and make sure that team has good scan points, knows where they're going, and can keep it well stocked. Well, this was a great conversation. Lots more to talk about tray logistics for the season, from scan points and tracking systems to, trays getting shipped across town in a last minute emergency. Lots of considerations around tray logistics. So looking forward to continuing these conversations throughout the season. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Until we talk to you again next time on the show, on behalf of Angela and myself, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.